Hello, Daniel. I'm back again.
Sandy,
It's
how we
me,
doing, Sandy?
Sandy, here to interrogate Daniel on thoughts
I'm
because, everyone enjoyed our conversation last time and said we should, do the remaining 96 chapters. That's what we plan on doing one step at a time.
delightful. Well, Sandy,
Yeah,
I'm thrilled to do it again. I enjoyed the conversation very much last time. So thank you so much for wanting to do it.
absolutely. The pleasure's all mine. And I remember, you and Michelle described thoughts as a box of chocolate. So I thought I would just pick a few random chapters and they
Excellent.
have no connection whatsoever, but I think we'll try and find a connection because, that's up to the readers, right?
There you go.
We're supposed to crack the code. Uh, so let's talk about the unexamined life isn't easy to live.
Mm.
I think it's very interesting, and it's a very short chapter too. I think it's one of the few short chapters in the book. And obviously, the quote comes from Socrates
Mm.
because he thinks a life without, introspection is a life deprived, and that is true. So I think what I found very interesting was, you touch upon worry versus care, empathy and sympathy, and it's very difficult in modern times to define what is an examined life because there is the fear of missing out, and the advancement in science and technology tells you or shows you what kind of life you should be living,
Mm.
which creates a complex in people thinking, their life isn't worth living or it's not good enough. And even the word examine, I think, are you inspecting? Are you exploring? Are you trying to sort of raise self-awareness, or are you just chasing behind the endless possibilities that exist in the world, objectively and subjectively both?
Mm.
So I would like to know your thoughts on that, Daniel.
Lovely, Sandy. It's very interesting, when Socrates says the unexamined life isn't worth living. There's a sense in which I think that can be a little too far. There are plenty of people that never study philosophy that are very just more down to earth, that seem to have very fulfilling lives. They seem to be very happy. One would be careful to suggest that would say without philosophy, your life is going to be unhappy or something like that. What the piece tries to argue, though, is that not engaging in, say, examination of philosophy is basically something similar to choosing not to have a fire extinguisher in your house. 99.9% of the time, you don't need a fire extinguisher. But when you do need the fire extinguisher, not having it can cost you a lot. You can lose everything, actually. And now there is an argument to be made, and this is talked about in Belonging again and some other works like with David Hume, that as the world becomes more interconnected, globalized, pluralized, and different things like that, that something that David Hume kind of refers to, well, Donald Livingston talks about it as this, as the mass philosophical consciousness begins to spread. And what he means by that is something what like Peter Berger says, where everyone today is forced to be an existentialist. We're all condemned to be existentialists because you're kind of forced to see, on the TV, on the phone, on the internet, different ways of doing things, different views. And that makes you, of course, reflect on yourself and be like, why do I think the way that I think? And so it would definitely seem as if the average person is increasingly being forced to be existential. But that doesn't actually necessarily mean that they become, quote unquote, philosophical, even if there's a sense in which they become philosophical. By that, I mean they do not make a point to think about these matters systematically. And as a result, that can lead to a lot of anxiety. That can lead to a lot of mental health issues, a lot of problems, a lot of confusion. And actually, for a lot of people like Hunter and Reef and all them, in that existential anxiety, totalitarianism becomes very appealing, precisely to bring back a feeling of social stability. Without philosophy, without examination, the likelihood that one gets sucked into a totalitarian movement or sucked into mental anxiety or sucked into even mental health problems goes up because they don't have the skill by which to deal with all of those of that abstract reasoning or questioning of which is basically forced upon them due to pluralization, the internet and globalization and so on and so forth. However, I still want to say that I think it is too far to say that an unexamined life is necessarily a life that's not worth living. It just seems that it is practically, as in usually and very often, going to prove, especially as we advance in history, it's going to prove not to be a very good quote unquote insurance policy. It's going to prove not to be very practical in the same way that not having a fire extinguisher in your in the same way that not having a fire extinguisher in your house would be a risky strategy, or things like that. So you mentioned sympathy and empathy.
Yes.
For most of your life, not really knowing the difference between those two, maybe even 90% of the time, doesn't really matter. Doesn't have a big impact. You're able to go through your day and so on and so forth. But sympathy and empathy are in fact different. And if you don't know that difference, you may employ sympathy when really what you should be employing is empathy. And as a result, you may hurt a relationship, you may fail to understand a situation properly, so on and so forth. So sympathy would be where you say, I'm sorry that you went through X, Y, and Z. Empathy is literally trying to think of the world. It's an act of really critical thinking. It's much more intellectual than emotional, where you're saying, let me try to think of the world through the system and worldview of the other person. Now, the reason empathy, though, is so incredibly difficult is because what we tend to do as human beings, they always say, put your feet in another person's shoes. What we actually tend to do is put our shoes in another person's shoes, meaning we tend to think of another person's worldview through our worldview, not as their worldview to itself or themselves to themselves, right? That's the trick of empathy. That's what makes it so incredibly difficult, because obviously it's impossible to enter the consciousness of another person perfectly. But how can you do it better than not, right? Just because you can't get 100% on the test doesn't mean you can't get a 99, right? And so empathy is that very hard work of doing everything in your power to try to see a situation through another person's point of view, right? And that's going to take a lot more than just an emotional impression that it's a hard situation. You're going to have to really think about it. Now, again, the feeling of saying, I'm sorry that you went through something, feels like you're seeing the world through their eyes because you're sympathizing, but it is not the same. And if you don't understand that, you may actually then proceed to thinking on grounds of that sympathy that you know the best political program to fix the situation, or the best way to go about fixing their broken relationships, when you are actually arriving at that solution still through your worldview or your understanding of the situation that is missing critical information. And in missing that critical information, you may go about and do something that makes things a lot worse, right? Yeah. And yet you are compelled to do that by sympathy. And in doing that, perhaps that ruins the relationship, and now your life is at a lower quality because you've lost that relationship, or maybe you've created a conflict. So there again, for most of your life, you don't need to know the difference between sympathy and empathy, maybe. But when you do, if you don't know it, the consequences can be very, very dire. And it is probably the case, and then I'll give it back to you, it is probably the case as the world pluralizes, as greater and greater difference and different personalities are in contact, that the need to be able to know that distinction between empathy and sympathy is going to go up. Whereas, say, 200 years ago, if you were encountering neighbors who lived down the street, they probably were relatively similar to you. They were probably, whatever your religion was, they probably worked similar jobs, they probably knew similar people. So even if you didn't have empathy, you simply understood their situations through your worldview, there was a higher chance that that would still be good enough, simply because they shared your common life, basically. They had a shared intelligibility. Now, that is not so given, but after thousands of years being trained to think that, you can just basically assume shared intelligibility, we may not be ready to understand why getting this difference between empathy and sympathy is so pronounced. And I make that example to suggest that I do think as pluralization, globalization, internet intensifies, the need for philosophy goes through the roof, even though technically I still don't want to make the claim that the unexamined life isn't worth living, because that seems like to go too far. But what I do want to claim is that the unexamined life is probably not a good bet. You're probably going to end up in situations where having examined life would have been a better policy than not.
Right. I agree. I mean, that is all wonderful. But I think the main problem in modern times is the way people believe their lives need to be examined. Because obviously Socrates wrote this at a time where, there was a deeper meaning and there was supposed to be a purpose for your existence, and you were supposed to seek something beyond what is conventional and materialistic than the times we live in now. And especially with, the youth these days, the fear of missing out is something that really keeps coming to my mind when I read this chapter, and this whole idea of not having seen enough, not having accomplished enough, not having traveled enough.
Excellent.
That is what sort of defines the outcome, the tangible instant result of saying I've been to so many places, I've done so many things, seen so many different, important stuff. And I think that's one of the main reasons why, yes, it isn't easy to live an unexamined life, but I think it's even harder to live an examined life in the current times, because your definition of examining is so different, and some would say not as succinct and purposeful as it should be, because you'd be out there, you'd be online, and you'd say, oh, this place looks wonderful, X is over there, we should go there next summer. Those are the kind of conversations that happen day to day, because that's how your value or the life you live is sort of weighed upon. And when you talk about empathy and sympathy, people really don't empathize anymore, because they don't understand the concept of empathizing, and sympathy is almost a trump card to sort of justify what you're doing and how you are living, and that is something you actively seek. I feel like a lot of people seek sympathy when it comes to matters that are probably not as problematic as they perceive, but purely because they feel they haven't examined their lives in a certain way than the way they see it online, or with their colleagues, or even your neighbor. There's so much competition in the way you examine life, and the whole examination is just not feasible. It doesn't work. I think those are my thoughts on
those are excellent thoughts, and what you're actually getting at right there is precisely a reason why today the philosophical examination is so critical, because even what the word examination now means, you have to do a meta move to say, well, what do we mean by examination? Whereas in the past, there may have been a shared intelligibility. So there's a few things you said that were really, really important. When Socrates talks about examination, he's talking about philosophical examination. But what has happened today, and this has to be explored primarily in Belonging Again, is what Philip Reeve calls the triumph of the therapeutic, which is basically all examination that occurs today is therapeutic examination, which is sort of a be true to yourself, emotionally express yourself. It's more like an expressionalism, which is a little different from a certain level of examination to get through. Examination in the philosophical sense is working through your own tendencies of self-deception, irony, ignorance, self-congratulation, self-righteousness, and those different things. Well, that's certainly not what people mean today under the reign of the therapeutic when they say examine yourself. They mean know yourself and be authentic and true to yourself, but they mean that in terms of an emotional confirmation. Like you know yourself if you feel good about yourself. In the past, it would actually, a lot of philosophers would say, no. It's precisely when you feel good about yourself that you're probably most self-deceived. Wait a minute, you must be slow to assume that feeling good about yourself means that you are in fact good. It might, but it also might not. And that's where the philosophical examination is a really, really big deal. Actually, what you're getting at, in my opinion, is all the more reason why probably today philosophical examination is utterly necessary, because otherwise you just get pulled along by all of the experientialism, by the emotionalism, by all of the don't miss outism, and you have no way to stop it because it just pulls you along, actually.
The vacuum cleaner. Yes.
David Hume precisely warned that philosophy that was what he called false philosophy was actually did this. It pulled you out of common life, out of yourself, into an infinite expansion of experience and seeing new things and correcting people and being yourself, that it ended up actually destroying the world, basically. It became a force of radical destruction. On that point, there's a phrase that him and Vico would use, and it's called the barbaricism of reflection and the barbaricism of refinement, where there's actually a form of reflection that is barbaricism because it is destructive and it's treating everything as a means to an end. Actually, there was, dang it, I forget his name. There was an Italian philosopher who gave a lecture not too long ago talking about the new barbaricism. And what he called that is basically the touristy expression, like everyone, no one lives anywhere, they just visit places. They don't have any stakes and they're not embedded in anything. They're not committed to everything. And he's like, You know who else was never committed to anything and just roamed the countryside doing whatever they wanted to do? Barbarians. And so basically everything that you're describing for him is the new barbaricism, really. And that is a result of a misdefined examination. That is an examination that is done on terms of the therapeutic and not missing out. And the reason why the fear of missing out is tied to the therapeutic is because it feels bad to miss out. It feels good not to miss out. And so then as a certain therapy, you're always seeking new experiences, new thrills, new people. But the problem with that is it's a kind of barbaricism because you're just using everything for your own ends. You're not committed to everything. Now, at the same time, there's also a form of philosophical examination that is very rooted, but it doesn't go anywhere, right? So, there's like introvert, extrovert, and all that, which are problematic terms, but there's some use to them. It's more useful to think of extroversion as horizontal and an introvert as vertical. If you're vertical, but only vertical, you don't go anywhere. You're deep, but you don't go anywhere. But if you're horizontal, but only horizontal, you cover a lot of distance, but you're shallow, right? So the name of the game is figuring out how to do, obviously, both, something more horizontal, right? Well, right there, you need examination. Right there, you need the philosophical examination to try to determine what would that best look like? What does it look like to have a balance between the distance and the deep, right? And I will definitely say that today in our interconnected world, and then I'll give it back to you, the error is far more on the side of distance than depth. It is far more on the side of the barbaricism of refinement, reflection, and this travelism, this expressionism. And again, for Hume and Vico, the barbaricism of reflection is where you treat everything as something either to think about, as in it's a mere subject for philosophical reflection, or you treat everything basically as just material for experience, something that you can later think back on and go, oh, I had so much fun. Oh, that was so fun. You're just treating everything as a means to having memories. And there's actually something very problematic about that, because it is in service of you, because it's nice to have those nice memories. And there's a certain barbaricism in that.
Yes. And I think another sort of theme that you touch upon in the chapter is worrying versus caring. And I think that's very important too, because, coming back to the previous point about empathy and sympathy, the whole point of having an examined life to begin with is to understand and have a sense of life and being and existence with your purpose. And right now, at least in the times that we live in, people purely worry about their lives and actually care for it and think deeply into investing into something more, wholesome. And the definition of wholesome is also, subjective, because everything is. But I think when you talk about worrying and caring, we live in a society that's constantly worrying instead of caring for anything that truly matters, because, you worry to keep up, you worry to stay in touch, you worry too much about not worrying too much. Anxiety is something that, and stress is something that people actively pursue now. And that's true, coming back to the point where you said, if you feel really good about yourself, then there is some self-deceit there. But in modern days, it's not so much about your attributes or the way your mind thinks, or, are you being a reductionist in your thoughts? It's really about how much you're achieving. The sense of accomplishment directly defines how examined your life is. It's like, oh, have you exploited your full potential? Oh, you're not seeking your full potential. But there is a very lack of self-existence in that life, which is very ironic, I feel. And when you talk about caring, what is caring in the modern day compared to how it was when, people actually cared about thought and creating something meaningful and investing in art and literature and actually questioning what's being written. Whereas right now, it's more about, even when you talk about examining, it's purely a test. There is no test of understanding. You don't accept what exists. You're very much testing it and you're trying to change it. And that's pretty much how people live their lives mostly these days. And talking about worrying and caring, I think it's a fine line, and it's a very thin line, because we think we care about so many things, but we really just try to micromanage those things and micromanage people's lives and the relationships in our lives. I mean, you touch upon worrying versus caring and make an example about how you pursue your spouse. And, if you're too worried, you're actually possessive. But that's likely to drive the other person crazy, quite literally, other words. in the chapter, and that's true, and that is very much the outcome of modern dating and relationships these days, because, and that also comes with how examined your life is in the modern day. If someone is accomplished, if someone travels, if someone is an overachiever, then the other person who isn't, or the lack in the relationship as they would define it, would constantly worry about keeping up. So there is really no sense of caring or affection or anything genuine there. It's just you're constantly worried to sort of check the boxes and balance the scales. And, it's a power play, not just in politics, but even in family dynamics and in relationships. And yes, an unexamined life isn't easy to live, but in the modern day, I think an examined life is the very bane of our existence.
Well, a few things. Everything you said was extremely good. Basically, without what Socrates is talking about it is as an examined life. What happens is you go into the unexamined, which then turns into the false examination. And that's where you're screwed, basically. Like David Hume really wants to emphasize true philosophy and false philosophy. And that's a really important distinction in his work. And basically, he makes the argument that if you don't have the return to common life for him, which is you start in a common life, you're not philosophical, then you go on the philosophical journey, you become philosophical, but then you're tempted to stay in the ivory tower. And he thinks that's destructive. You have to come back to common life. If you stay in common life without philosophy, there's a lot of risk, like we talked about at the beginning, right? Banality of evil, Hannah Arendt, and all that. But if you go to the ivory tower and you stay there, then you become a force of destruction because you don't have to relate your thinking to any actuality or common life. And so then examination becomes a force of destruction. It becomes a force of deconstruction, and it becomes a force of constant self-examination that becomes a snake eating its own tail. Basically, the world today is not defined by people staying in common life and not being philosophical. It's defined by people going to the quote unquote ivory tower and staying there. Because that doesn't mean just going to college. That means getting online and thinking and being examination. Like what's happening is the spread of the philosophical consciousness. And what the way that Hume calls, a way to look at that is a spread of false examination. Okay. So what you have today is infinite examination, and arguably would almost be better off if people went back to common life than this current state, because it is so destructive. And we see how destructive it is in terms of mental health. However, for David Hume, and I think this is true, you basically can't go back to common life without this examination unless you're Amish, right? Unless you literally cut yourself off from the world. So what we have to do is push through into quote unquote true philosophy and true examination, but that is very difficult. But that's kind of the negation sublation that I also think you could associate with Hegel, where the next development of history. Now, a few more things. Precisely in that difficulty of telling the difference between worry, care, and then how status is mixed with worry, because if you're worried, it means you must be important. That right there is the mixture of concepts of which, without philosophy, you're at the mercy of happening. Just one day you find yourself thinking that worrying and being important are the same thing. Why did you start thinking that? Where did it come from? Hard to say. It's probably because your friends do it, probably because you saw it on TV, but you just start thinking it. And now you're basically like a bird pulled on a string, to use an image from Faulkner, where you think you're living the life you want to live, but actually you're being pulled by bad philosophy or the zeitgeist and don't even know it, because you've made a faulty conflation of status and stress and worry. You don't even realize you've done this, but because you have done this, and then worse yet, you lack the philosophical tools to realize you've done this, then you're basically, almost to use language from Calvin, totally depraved. You know, Kierkegaard once said that the problem with the man in despair is that he doesn't know he's in despair. If you know you're in despair, then you're actually not the man in despair because you're on the way out, right?
Yeah.
This is the structure of what occurs without philosophy. You make conflations that lead to living your life according to ideas that then necessarily, rationally pull you to a place you don't want to go. And the only way to stop that then is true reflection, true philosophy, but also probably part of that false philosophy structure is the idea that you don't need true philosophy. So then it really facilitates itself. It really silos itself in very problematic ways. And that's definitely what is occurring today in mass. And if it is not deconstructed, I think it's going to prove very, very difficult. The other thing I would say is that the distinction between worry and fear, like care and fear, that's care and worry, that language, I think that's one of the most pressing topics because it is not evident what that difference is. But one of the ways we can look at it is that worry is self-relation to itself, where there's no way to stop it. Whereas worry tends to be very internal, whereas care at least has an external object. So for example, you have a flower growing in a garden and you go out every single day to make sure the flower's okay, right? Is that worry or is that care? It's actually probably care because literally you have to go and check the environment, right? And precisely because there's a physical object to check and balance, you can kind of bind your worry to that object because what's there to worry about? You watered it, you put the fertilizer on it and so on and so forth. So there's a way in which by having the thing that you're concerned about being external, it can bind your worry from becoming over the top in a kind of paranoia. But here's the problem. What if I say you need to make the most of your potential as opposed to you need to make sure that flower's growing? If I tell you make sure that flower's growing, you can go out and check it and we can both look at it and say, oh, Sanduni, you did make sure that flower's okay because there's a physical object we can look at. But when I tell you to make the most of your potential, what are we even talking about? Yeah. That's completely internal. There's no way to check it. There's no standard by which to confirm it. So it's an idea relating to an idea. It's a self-relation to itself. And here's the problem with a self-relation to itself. It's a snake eating its own tail. It's a self-relating negativity, to use a Zizekian term. You are doomed because there's no way to confirm it. Like, what does it mean to, there's no reference point other than yourself, but that's self-contained, referencing itself. So you don't know if you've met the standard because maybe all you've done is just be yourself, not met the most of your potential, right? So it's vapid, it's empty. The majority of people today are determining if they are making the most of their life according to standards that eat them. And it's one of the great tragedies of our world is you have a world of people who are deciding if they're making the most of their lives according to self-relating negativity, which means that the majority of people think they are good planners, productive people, smart, intelligent by being a snake that eats its own tail. That is our current standard of making the most of our potential because making the most of our potential is a vapid notion. But right there is evidence of what happens without philosophical examination. If you do not have good philosophical examination, the nature of the human being, and then I'll give it back to you, seems to be there is something about the human that seems naturally oriented to become a snake eating its own tail. That seems to be in our nature. I think it's because reality, there's a phrase we use forever, the fabric of reality is irony. There seems to be something about irony that is deeply ontological and that human beings without philosophical reflection tend to become a snake eating its own tail, especially probably under globalization and pluralization. Again, before interconnectability, the likelihood of becoming a snake eating its own tail may have been less or at least not as accelerated. But now it seems accelerated because of the tensions of the modern world, because of the wondering of how do I stack up against the people in like other countries? How do I stack up against the other colleges? Of which leads one to assenting to vapid notions that turn us into snakes eating our own tails. So I think that what you've talked about is certainly an accurate diagnosis of the world today.
Indeed, I try. Thank you for that, Daniel. Now that you mentioned, self-reflection and, modern day people being their own tail eaters, the snakes that are biting off their own tail, it's true. That leads me on to my next chapter, which is quite apt, I feel. I'm glad I picked it and the conversation totally went that way. Critical people aren't critical thinkers is also one of my favorite chapters. It's on page number 206.
Yes, ma'am.
If our viewers want to, quickly have a look while you listen to this conversation.
Perfect.
And, you examine Well, it says just because we're critical of something doesn't mean we've been critically thinking about it. And I think that is a very apt phrase to describe what we talked about in the unexamined life, because people are very self-critical right now, but they don't really sort of understand or think about why they are so critical about X, Y, and Z. It's more of a negative opinion. And, I think it's important to sort of discuss critical thinking versus critical criticism. Those are the two things that, the chapter really examines. And like, what is the difference, Daniel? What is the difference between the two? You tell us. You wrote this. You tell us.
Excellent. And no, I think that's a perfect thing to examine. I think there is a temptation to believe that just because we criticize something means we've critically thought about it, because it feels like we did. Also, it's another paper, and I've spoken with it to Ethan Nelson. There's a kind of game theory of dynamic. There's a game theory dynamic at play where the dominant strategy in a conversation is to be the person who's critical, upset, angry, or hurt. Because if I think, oh, well, that's bad, the artist, for example, suddenly I'm the center of attention because I think the work is bad. All the people that said it was good, they're like, for some reason, they don't count. They just said that. They couldn't possibly have meant it. But the one who tells you your art sucks, for some reason, we assume that person's telling the truth. None of that follows. The person who says it's bad may just be saying that, but there's something about the human that associates negativity with reality. When, of course, that doesn't follow. That's a presupposition that we hold, right? So there's a game theory for a person in a conversation who wants to establish dominance in the conversation. There is unfortunately there's a sense in which it is rational to be a critical person because you get all the power and everyone has to cater to you. So this gets into game theory, Nash equilibrium, and different things like that. So that's one of the reasons why this conflation has probably occurred, because it is so prevalent that people are critical to establish power, that then the fact that they get power and everyone turns to them makes them look smart. So they must be the critical thinker. So there's, they get all the power. They're the dominant player in the conversation. So they must be smart because they figured that out. And then there's also something that makes it feel like when a person says that is bad, that they're seeing through it, that they're getting to the depths of it, and they're seeing what's really there. None of that necessarily follows, but we associate that with all of that. Critical thinking, there's a paper called On Critical Thinking. And the argument of that paper is basically, we already mentioned it, critical thinking is actually basically empathy. The ability to occupy another worldview, another internally consistent system, check and balance it according to its own axioms, not your axioms, and to see if it holds up. So for example, if you say Finnegan's Wake is a stupid book, maybe it is a stupid book. But you would have to go into Finnegan's Wake and see if James Joyce, according to his own premises and standards and attentions, accomplished and managed to do what he wanted to do. Now, let's say he did. You could still make the argument of, okay, fine, James Joyce clearly wrote an encyclopedia, but the point of a novel is not to be a collection of cool tricks. It's supposed to be a story, and Finnegan's Wake fails as a story. Right. You could make that argument, and that would be a fair argument. But notice that critique is different from saying it's gobbledygook. Right? There is a different act that is taking place. Another way to think about this, critical thinking is like what a movie critic does for a movie. Okay. So a movie critic kind of watches a movie different than an average person does. An average person basically lets the movie wash over them. A movie critic asks questions of structure, character development, plot design, theme, intentions, meanings. They indeed care about they definitely care about the entertainment value, but they're not only watching it for the entertainment value. They are also watching it in terms of its thematic structure and organization as itself. So to critically think about something is to be like a critical movie critic toward a movie. The main thing, and then I'll give it back to you, that actually we have to be critical thinkers of is the very way that our own brain structures reality toward us. That is the main thing we have to be a critical thinker of. Not merely, a lot of people are like, oh, a critical thinker is someone who questions things. That's true, but actually critical thinking is more phenomenological, dare I say. Like you are actually like the movie of life that your brain is presenting you to, that your brain presents you with, you become like the movie critic to.
Yeah.
And you're examining, how is my brain structuring this information toward me to make me fall into confirmation bias? How is my brain making me fall into self-deception and irony? How is my brain hiding from me the axioms that I assume to assume my worldview? So to be a true critical thinker, you become a kind of movie critic to your own world. You become a thought critic of your own thinking that your brain presents to you. And you have to be aware of that. Now, of course, if a movie critic comes in and says, all movies suck, well, then they're not going to be a movie critic. So if you say, well, I can't trust anything my brain says, well, then you fall into epistemic nihilism. And that's actually kind of easier. If you can just simply say, oh, I can't trust anything my brain presents me with, well, then you don't have to think, because you just disqualify all thoughts. The real critical thinker is not an epistemic nihilist. A real critical thinker is someone who trusts in thoughts, but also knows that thoughts can mislead. But not because thoughts are intentionally misleading, but because of the nature of the structure of thoughts themselves to lead us in problematic directions. So that sort of phenomenological examination, if you grant me that phrase, is a lot of what critical thinking is. And the reason why this is really important is because we tend to just associate a critical thinker with somebody who questions what the TV tells you or questions what you read in newspapers. Of course, you don't want to just absorb everything you read, but that's basically level one. That's really just kind of level one. Level two is to turn into a thought critic, similar to a movie critic. But we're not even going to get there if we don't even make the distinction between being critical and critical thinking. And that's, again, another example where without philosophical examination, two ideas conflate together. And then you go through your life thinking you're a critical thinker simply because you are critical. And you don't even realize you're doing that. And then all of the consequences that come your way.
Yes, absolutely. I agree. I think, yes, when you talk about critical thinking, it has to be this sort of intellectually disciplined process of conceptualizing, analyzing, applying, doing research, and sort of, coming into an actual belief about what's being presented or what's being read or seen. Whereas just, being critical in very much in the present day is about finding fault. It is inclined towards finding fault purely. And I feel like a lot of people nowadays, especially, aren't critical thinkers because they're very critical, negatively critical about themselves and very hard on themselves about the way they live their lives. Again, the unexamined comes into connection with this. I'm just trying to connect chapters because even though I've just, cherry picked them, but they're all interconnected. It's very well written, Daniel, truly. And I'm not biased because we're friends. I think it's good work. It really is. All things good, true, and beautiful, right? That's how it goes.
Yes, ma'am.
And I think another thing when you talk about, how when you sort of examine art or a film, the person that says the negative thing somehow is known to be the smartest or the person who knows better. But I think the only commendable thing there is their audacity to be the person to speak up. Because I think when you're a critical thinker, you also critically analyze why you think about X, Y, and Z the way you do. And that could perhaps hold you back from giving a very succinct, precise, evaluated sort of feedback or, writing a literary review on a film. But someone who's negative and trying to find fault, it's very easy to do that. It's just easy and it's blunt and, it's out there. And obviously people are captured by negativity more than positivity. People like to go, even on reviews, when we go to purchase something or go for a book, we first look for the negative reviews. I think it's something we innately do. We don't look for the positives. And I think when you talk about critical thinking and an unexamined life, what are you thinking about is the first question. Like, what do you think about? What keeps you up at night is a question I like to ask. Like, what do you ponder about? Are you critical on yourself? And are you weighing things based on materialistic elements, or is it financially? Is it socially? Is it the number of friends you have, number of followers you have online? What is it? What is it that you're critical about? And I mean, the title is very interesting. Critical people aren't critical thinkers, because you're critical about matters purely because you haven't thought about it. It's that simple. That's the blunt truth, because you are unable to comprehend your own thoughts or even question your own mind. And I think that's one of the many reasons why people believe their lives are not fully examined, or they haven't reached their full potential. Because what is full potential? How are you defining it? Now, you talk about the movie critic, and you mentioned David Gosley saying a contrarian thinker is a better improved metaphor to describe critical thinkers. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Excellent. Well, a few things.
I quite like the terminology myself. I think it's very not as broad as critical thinker is, and it doesn't have negative connotations compared to the other, certainly.
Oh, yeah. Well, there's a few things. One of the keys to contrarian thinking, I'll just note very quickly, is usually to be a contrarian thinker, you take on risk, meaning that if you're wrong, you lose something, which means that the game theory dynamic that can incentivize you to be critical is balanced by that very risk. So that's something I'll note just quite quickly. Now, I also want to note everything you were saying about how examined people don't tend to speak up. That goes back to what we were saying about distance, depth, and we need to be the middle, basically, because the distance people find it easy to say, oh, it's bad, where the deep people may see a problem, but they're not going to say anything because it's the paralysis of examination, kind of like Nietzsche talks about with the centipede, where you're like, oh, well, maybe I don't know. Oh, maybe it is good and I'm not seeing it. And so you don't say anything. Yeah. Basically everyone, again, I have trouble with the terms introvert and extrovert. Basically everyone has to be an ambivert, which is both. And that means no one has an advantage, because it doesn't seem like many people are born ambivert, right? It seems like what tends to occur is people tend to be born more on the extrovert side, more on the introvert side, but there's almost like a cosmic justice, because it doesn't seem as if ambiversion is so natural. That seems to be something one has to work into. And again, that would all, and I will also note, what we're getting at here, again, is the huge theme of deconstructing common life in David Hume, which is, again, if we do not develop good examination, we'll still examine. It's just going to be bad, destructive examination. And the game is on, basically. Like, you're part of this. Like, rather, anyone on planet Earth, especially now due to globalization, you are in the middle of this problem. And you can't choose to not be part of it unless you're literally going to be isolationist. Like, truly isolationist. And that's not what most people do. And so that's really important. Like, you're in this game. And now the choice is bad examination or good examination, or isolationism. Most people aren't going to do that. So then basically we have to somehow get through the mass philosophical consciousness of bad examination and get to good examination, which that's quite a challenge, but I think it is what is necessary. Now, on the contrarian thinker, a contrarian thinker is somebody, like, if you say, oh, I'm going to take a position that no one else is going to take, it is not a position necessarily from I think this is bad. A way to look at this, the critical person says, that's bad. The contrarian thinker says, no one else thinks this, but I think this. It's much more positive, but it's different. So criticism tends to be negative, but it's of the same subject. Like, you're just saying that you're in the dichotomy of people think it's good, people think it's bad. The contrarian thinker tends to be outside of the dichotomy and tends to ascribe to something that people don't think at all, that they're not aware of. Someone like a Peter Thiel is a famous individual for stressing the contrarian thinker. And investment contrarian thinking is so interesting because you also tend to lose money if you're wrong, right? I am a strong believer that risk is epistemologically valuable, that someone who takes on a risk in thinking X is more likely to be right or wrong, or let's put it this way, they are more likely to be genuine in what they think, as opposed to someone who doesn't take on any risk, right? Because risk, you have skin in the game. And then, of course, we have the great Nassim Taleb writing his book on skin in the game, right? And so a contrarian thinker, especially one who has skin in the game, tends to be of a higher probability of someone of whom is going to be a reliable source of information. Maybe not, but at the very least, they probably have thought about it a lot. So there's something to learn there. Even when a contrarian thinker is wrong, precisely because of all the difficulty in being contrarian and being different and taking on risk, there's probably going to be something to learn there. And that alone makes that individual more worth looking into, even if ultimately they're wrong, because it takes a certain personality, it takes a certain willingness, it takes a certain way of doing things and a certain way of thinking that probably will benefit us to know and to learn from, as opposed to merely someone who's critical. But someone who's a critical person, unfortunately, tends to get all the they tend to get all the attention because people go, well, why don't you like it? Why don't you like it? Why do they like it? And I'm like, I just don't. And like they're like it's like one of those blue lights that attracts all the mosquitoes, right? Like all the mosquitoes are pulled out. Like someone who's just critical weirdly tends to attract people of whom are made worse off because of that attraction, actually, because they don't even learn how to think or they don't get something of value that they know what to do with. Whereas if you go to a contrarian thinker, sure, the individual may be wrong, but you're much more likely to at least learn something from that individual in thinking like them. Now, another detail is contrarian thinkers also tend to take on asymmetry. In investment, what that means is they tend to take on a bet that if they're right, they make 10 times. They bet 100 and they make 1,000 or whatever. And so they tend to look for contrarian bets because of the asymmetry involved. Now, that's an investment term, but actually something similar applies to philosophy, where when you find asymmetrical contrarian philosophers or thinkers, if they are right, it tends to have a massive impact in a positive way on your life, on your thinking, or it opens new doors. So that's another reason why taking a contrarian thinker seriously can be very good, because of the potential asymmetry. And the last thing I'll say is, yes, there is something good about looking for the negative review on the movie, because there tends to be something that comes out. But there's a big difference between the 1-star review that says this sucks, as opposed to the 4.5-star review that then gives you 5 paragraphs of their reasons, right? And so that also, unfortunately, we tend to either just look for 5 stars that don't say anything, look for 1 stars that say it sucks, but very few of us are going to actually read the 4 paragraphs of either maybe a 5-star has 5 paragraphs. You're like, oh, wow, they really believe this. Or maybe a 3-star does. To be someone who engages in critical thinking, we must be willing to put in the time to read the whole thing. That's really another reason why the game theory dynamics tend to favor criticism or even superficiality. There is a game theory dynamic to just be superficial, and that's dangerous, shallow, and that leads you to all the problematic examinations we talked about. The thing that is difficult is to be the individual who's really going to read what someone thought, to really take the time to listen to them. But that is what is required for good examination, true philosophy, and avoiding all these problematic game theory dynamics.
That's very true. I agree. And I think when you talk about good examination or examination and being critical thinkers, as you know, I feel like the modern day critics, even those who try and evaluate and assess literature or history or philosophy, very much focus on dismantling what exists instead of building from it. And that is very much the incentive that drives people to be critical in the modern day. If something's existed throughout time, it should not anymore.
Right.
That's the first goal. And there is this constant dissemination and dismantling of beliefs and thoughts that is very much associated with the modern day critical thinker.
Yes.
Or those who, you know, are self-proclaimed critical thinkers, or philosophers, even contemporary philosophers. It's very rare that you find someone who develops existing tradition instead of trying to say why it's wrong and why it should no longer exist, why we should get rid of it. And I think on page 207, you know, you talk about, there's the paragraph mentions, we are incentivized to always be critical, even if what's presented to us is best. Because an intelligent person is a critical thinker. If we ever accept how things are, we've stopped being critical, which suggests we've become fools.
Yeah.
And I think in the modern day, people very much just focus on not becoming fools by thinking that if you go on to changing what already exists and what is supposed to be good, and if you change it, that means, you know, you've done the right thing. Then that's what makes you intelligent or smart.
Yes.
So my question is, you know, when you talk about critical thinking, is there a right way to be critical about things?
Oh yeah, you have to earn it. You know, Bonhoeffer has this wonderful, Bonhoeffer has this wonderful distinction between in Cost of Discipleship between cheap grace and costly grace. And he's talking in the Christian tradition. And he says, cheap grace is when people say, I can sin all day and then ask God to forgive me of my sins and I'm good. He says, that's cheap grace. Costly grace is taking up your cross, being like Jesus, and being, you know, and all the difficulty that comes with that. So basically, he thinks modern Christianity, when he's writing in the West, World War II, so on, has been obliterated by cheap grace. What we see here today is a kind of cheap intellectualism as opposed to a costly intellectualism. And it is an intellectualism that assumes one is intelligent if one tears down, destroys, removes, gets rid of. Like you read a philosopher and you say, oh, they're wrong. Well, there's a game theory dynamic, because if you read Plato and say Plato's wrong, you're smarter than Plato. So right there's a puffing up that occurs, right? That's very dangerous. It is very difficult today to even start to approach what constitutes costly intellectualism when cheap intellectualism is so widespread. There's a great part, Chesterton, he has this great thing called Chesterton's fence. And what he means is if you come up on a forest and you see a fence and you look around and you're like, I have no idea why this is here. He says the modern prejudice is to therefore remove it. And he says, actually, if you don't know why it's there, all the more reason not to remove it, because you don't know what it may unintentionally cause by removing it. There might be a reason it is there. And this is called the Chesterton fence fallacy. Likewise, Nassim Taleb warns, he asks a question, he says, hey, if you had to choose between which book you think people are going to be reading 100 years from now, is it going to be the current #1 seller on the New York Times, or is it going to be Emily Dickinson? Well, you would say, of course, it's probably going to be Emily Dickinson. Why? Because books are things that the longer they're around, the higher the probability they stay around, right? Now, human beings are creatures that if you had to take a bet between an 80-year-old or 20-year-old being alive next year, you'd bet the 20-year-old, right? Because it changes relative to what you're talking about. He also makes the example of trees. A tree that is 500 years old is actually more likely to be around than a tree that's 80 years old because of the way that they grow and the strength they must have to be around, right? So the first thing for being a critical thinker is you have to know the ontology of the thing you are asking about, right? Like you have to know what the thing is, right?
Yeah.
And that is a huge step, because how do you even determine what a thing is? Oh, well, you have to dwell with it. Oh, you have to really study it and research it, right? Maybe that fence in the forest needs to be removed, but you got to go walk around the property, find the farmer who put it up, ask him questions, do all of this work. There is absolutely a way to go about determining if the fence should be there or not, but you can't do it simply from the initial experience of saying, I don't know why this fence is here, let's take it off. That is the cheap intellectualism. And unfortunately, that is a lot what you mentioned on institutions and traditions and all these things. You know, so much of the Scottish Enlightenment was adamant that most of our thinking is not arrived at through one day waking up and having some intellectual insight into the nature of reality. It's a result of a slow accumulation of trial and error through time, where we gradually start to figure out what works and what doesn't. It's not because we're smarter than the past. We've just had more time to screw up, to learn what works and to stick to that, right? Yeah. So critical thinking, if the Scottish Enlightenment is correct, which I think they are correct, you could go through Haidt, you can go through a lot of different people. We don't see good evidence that, well, you can just take science. Science is a result of standing on the shoulders of people that came before us, right? You know, civilization tends to be a result not of people being smarter today, but having more time to accumulate knowledge through time, right? And so the first step to how we engage in a critical thinking, as opposed to being critical, is to ask the question of what ground we should stand on to begin our thinking. From where do we begin our thinking, and relative to what? Now, this is an important question, because that means the critical thinker, as opposed to the critical person, asks from what presuppositions and axioms and premises do we assume in the operations of our rationality. That is extremely different from simply being a person that is a critical person who simply says, I don't understand why this is here. Therefore, since the phenomenon cannot meet the standard of my understanding, it should thus be removed. That is what's going on today. That means your ground is basically yourself, because you're so smart. But of course, what are you to yourself? We spoke about it earlier. You are a snake eating your own tail. You are a self-relating negativity. So if everything in the world has to meet your standard to be accepted, that means it automatically is pulled into your self-relating negativity, and you become a force of destruction. You end up tearing everything down because you're a black hole that sucks the world into it. The other thing with that is basically you're saying, Thomas Nagel has a book called A View from Nowhere, and he warns that no thinking is from nowhere. All thinking requires a ground by which to begin thinking. Today, people are like, basically they're thinking from nowhere. They're assuming no ground. Well, that's a black hole. Everything gets eaten. So the first thing I'll say, and then I'll give it back to you, the first thing that a critical thinker has to do is think from grounds relative to grounds, move between grounds, and assume the ground until they have incredibly strong reason to believe the ground is faulty. But if something has been passed down to you from thousands of years, cultural ground is more like a book than it is a person. The older it is, the higher the probability that it is probably more right than wrong. Otherwise, it wouldn't have been passed down through history, right? Now, maybe it is not. Maybe it's full of prejudices and different things that have to be worked out. But it's different from saying that there are things that need to be worked out from it as opposed to it needs to all be destroyed. There's a difference between coming upon Chesterton's fence and saying, oh, it needs to be painted, as opposed to it needs to be removed. We can't tell that difference anymore. And again, there may be game theory dynamics for why we can't tell that difference, because telling that difference would require you to look at it, think about it, examine it, and be willing to paint it, where it's much easier either to say, oh, there's nothing wrong with it, and you stop thinking about it, or it's entirely wrong, and you tear it up and stop thinking about it. So as a principle, basically a critical thinker is someone who does not try to avoid active thinking. A critical thinker is not someone who is unwilling to engage in an active thinking about a phenomenon that may entail a long-term relationship with that phenomenon, an investment in that phenomenon. I guess I would say one of the key characteristics of a critical thinker is investment. If they're not invested in the thing, they're probably not critically thinking about it. They're probably either just superficial, or they're someone of criticism. Investment tends to be an indication of reality, because if they're invested in something and they come to then decide they need to remove it, well, they definitely don't want to remove it because they're invested in it. Therefore, there probably is very, very good reason to believe that it truly does need to be removed. A critical thinker is someone that tends to create a dialectic of incentives, because that very dialectic of incentives forces them in that dialectic to be more thoughtful and more invested in the thing and to be more concerned about it. So those would be some first things I would say about that.
Well, critical thinking is also subjective, because what you think about critically varies, which brings me to my next chapter. And my last chapter for this episode, because, less is more. And we come in series.
Yes, ma'am.
Let's talk about on the term subjective, which is on page 263. And it says it might not mean humility. Now, why did you say that, Daniel? Why do you bring in humility? Because, yes, we can talk about the dichotomy of subjective and objectivity, which will be sort of my next point. But I would like to hear why you've said it might not mean humility.
That's a great question. A lot of people, you succeed. A lot of people will act like, oh, that's just my subjective opinion, as if I don't have authority. That kind of backs them out. And there's a certain humility in claiming I'm not objective. The issue is, though, it may also be a way to avoid having to take a stand. It may also be a way to avoid that you have to take anything seriously, because if everything is just subjective, well, don't worry about it. Well, then you get to do what you want to do, right? You don't have to be so concerned. Also, funny enough, if everything is subjective, there's a way in which it's subjective to you. You subjugate it. You kind of enslave it to you in a funny way. And so there's this weird double move where you enslave everything to being something you don't have to worry about because it's just subjective. There's this really weird sleight of hand that can occur where you say, oh, that's subjective, meaning I don't need to worry about it. And that thing can't force me to worry about it because it's subjective to my It's a subject to me. And so this is the deviousness of subjective. So there's a few things that occurs with it. One, you say everything's subjective, therefore there's epistemic nihilism. So there's a nihilist view of it, which is really bad. Then there's a illusion of objectivity where you say subjective versus objective, which is not true. It's more complex. There's a paper in Conflict of Mind called Compelling that tries to work through these different things. Third, the other thing you can kind of do is start going that subjectivity like doesn't matter, like the subject doesn't matter because it's not objective. Or you can do this thing where you use subjectivity to make the world a subject to you, while simultaneously making it so you don't have to worry about it. So now those are all different. I'm not saying those tend to be in the same person, but those are all different unintentional consequences that can emerge when you have a hard subject-object dichotomy. Now, exactly what one would have to work through instead of that will get us into the fun of Hegel, compelling, conflict of mind, and what does it mean? And frankly, ultimately, what I call conditionalism, which is a middle ground for me between relativism and objectivism, which is where we as subjects, as people, are always conditioning what we observe, and it is conditioning us back in a feedback loop. And relative to how we condition ourselves impacts what we can experience and how we can experience. But that would be why I went with that subtitle there.
Well, thank you for, telling us why you chose to go with that subtitle. Now, subjective and objective, the definition has changed historically.
Yes.
There's this sort of metaphysical point of view, the fundamental nature of what exists versus, the fact that objective refers to something that has real existence in the world, independent of being thought of, whereas subjective is, refers to anything that sort of depends on a subconscious existence.
Yes.
Now then, my question is, and I've thought about this question quite a lot, and I expect a good answer. So, have the objects which we consider as real, as real existence, in fact, a real objective existence, independent of our mode of perceiving them? Is my question. I hope I phrased it correctly. I was meditating on it.
The question of, is there an ontic dimension? As in, is there a term that is used is ontic, meaning is there a reality independent of subjectivity, right? Well, there would be very good reason to believe this because, as the guy who wrote After Finitude points out, Quentin Minute starts with an M and I can't say it. He makes the point of like basically fossils. And he's like, we have fossils. We know that there was not the same human consciousness back in the time of dinosaurs, right? And so the fact that we have fossils would give us very good reason to think that there is a reality independent of human thought, right? Because otherwise you wouldn't have fossils. Now, you can proceed to go the simulation route and say we're on a simulation and the fossils are simulated. But you see, at that point, here's the issue. At that point, you can always come up with a hypothetical situation. That's how earlier we were talking about rationality relating to rationality and it becomes a snake eating its own tail. You can absolutely do that with reality as a whole. You can always create a narrative that explains how the fossils are not evidence of an ontic reality because it's a simulation or so on and so forth, right? But the question is the following. Is there a reason to think that we are in a simulation that is beyond a hypothetical syllogism? Like, do you experience anything that gives you reason to believe you're in a simulation? Like watching a line of 1 and 0s appear in front of you, like in the Matrix, right? Yes. If not, then even though you might be in a simulation, there is no reason to think that you are in a simulation. And the key distinction, and this comes up a lot in OG Rose, is between technical and practical, okay? Technically, you do not know that you aren't in a simulation. But practically, as in practice and approximately, you do have very good reason to believe you're not in a simulation, right? The key is that human beings can never access the technical, but who gives a crap because we only ever live the practical, right? So you have to do a kind of Occam's razor here in a way, right? And frankly, human life is organized by the practical, how you practically live your everyday life. And actually, you can arrive at legitimate philosophical conclusions based on the practical. Because here's the distinction. If one is looking for certainty, you cannot get certainty, but you can get confidence. The big mistake in modern philosophy has basically been that if we don't get certainty, we don't get anything, right? That's not true. And certainty is extremely dangerous because it is impossible. And when you don't get it, you will thus become an epistemic nihilist unless you understand that humans just need confidence. And here's the thing, what you are confident is true may in fact be true. Just because you can't technically know that is true does not mean it is ergo false, right? But you have enough reason to believe that it is worth the risk, the investment, like the contrarian thinker, right? Because you have never in your life had an experience of being in a simulator, right? So likewise, though we cannot technically access the ontic because we're stuck in the ontological, ergo we cannot access the world of objects to objects because we are stuck in the subject, we have good reason to think that the world exists without consciousness because of fossils, and because we have never had an experience to give us reason to think that the existence of phenomenon is contingent upon subjectivity, right? Which would be to say that things would not exist without consciousness, right? That's called panpsychism, right? So those are all things to start. Now, there is a question though, and this is where you start getting into an Owen Barfield, Rudolf Steiner, and Hegel, which it could be the case though, that now that consciousness has come into existence at whatever point in history it comes into existence, that the way the universe unfolds and ergo objects develop is different than before consciousness comes into existence. What I mean by that is once consciousness decides that a tree can be lumber, then a tree forever is possible lumber, right? And a tree, in fact, can be turned into lumber. And so what a tree is actually changed in its possibility by the introduction of consciousness. This is technically not the same as saying that that objects are just consciousness. What you are saying is that once consciousness comes into existence, the way that objects exist and carry themselves is different than before there was consciousness. And that, I think, is probably getting at the middle ground, right? But because of fossils, there is reason to think that objects exist outside of consciousness. Also, the famous example that was thrown at Kant is if I have a candle in one room and it's melting and I leave the room and I come back, it's still melting. Well, if the object's existence was dependent on my consciousness, the candles should not have kept melting when I walked away. You see what I'm saying? So because it melts, there's reason to think that the object of candle is not contingent upon consciousness, right? However, candles only exist because human consciousness came into reality to invent candles, right? So what happens now is at this point in history, there's a kind of feedback loop where the existence of objects and the existence of consciousness are always going together. And the way that Rudolf Steiner talks about, and look, it could be, now this is where we're entering into speculation. It could be, given quantum mechanics and all this stuff I do not understand, that there is some profound way that observation changes phenomenon, like the observer effect and objects and stuff like that. Rudolf Steiner even makes the example of saying, you know how a seed becomes a flower if it has soil, right? The existence of the seed is not contingent upon consciousness. Seeds exist even if there's no consciousness. But he says, what if, though, consciousness is like soil, that when introduced to objects, change how they unfold? Like a seed grows differently in soil, a seed becomes something different in soil than without soil. Do you understand what I'm saying? That is possible. But that is different from saying that objects are conscious dependent. This is the key distinction that I think is really important. There is good reason to think that objects are not conscious dependent because of fossils, okay? And the candle and all that. However, it is possible that now that there is consciousness, the way objects develop is different than they developed before consciousness, right? So again, a seed does not need soil to be a seed. It exists whether there's soil or not. But if it is put in soil, it changes into a flower, right? Yeah. That might be a possible scenario where objects are not dependent on consciousness, the subject, but once subjectivity is introduced into history, how objects unfold changes. To know that, you would have to be God. But also to assume it is not true would require you to be God. You see?
Yes.
That to me is the middle ground. And I think something like that is reasonable to consider, because otherwise we have this really hard object-subject divide that makes us very Kantianism, although Kant himself is more complex, that then tends to lead into epistemic nihilism and a certain like, oh, I'm just subjective in different things like that. So that would be how I respond to your excellent question.
And my next question is, do you think we live in a more subjective or objective world? It's a very broad question.
I think we live in the, I think unfortunately we live in the worst of all possible worlds, which is like a pathological objectivity that simultaneously is utterly subjective while denying the value of subjectivity. It's like the worst of all possible things. It's pathological, like in a kind of psychoanalysis sort of way. Like we have this really weird thing where science is the ultimate. It's like you either have people that are like science is the ultimate truth, or people are like science is a giant conspiracy. It's like very pathological, and it's a result of this split between subject and object. Like what ends up happening is so you get two things, and Quinton is quite good on this. If you say that subjects have no relation with objects because of a noumenon, then you get two responses. One, scientism, where the only truth is science, getting to the objects, removing the subject, okay? Or you get what Quinton calls, it's called fideism, which is basically an explosion of faith. And by faith, he's not just talking religious faith. He's talking conspiracies. He's talking like emotional impression. Like there's this crazy explosion of saying, oh, well, the only truth is subjective truth, right? So then everyone is like they're all in their own world, right? So the subject-object split given us by the legacy of Kantianism, even if Kant himself may have addressed it in the second critique, history tends to be made by misreadings, not by true readings, unfortunately. And so we live in a world of that, where you have one side of things is this crazy, like subjective self-relating truth is the only truth. I call it Pandora's rationality. It's this explosion of internally consistent systems to themselves that don't have to be tested against anything. Or you have this science is the only truth, and the scientists say, and they're basically your new priest class. They become kind of the rabbis, and no truth. There is no truth other than the scientifically verifiable truth. So we have a pathological mixture of fideism and scientism, and that's the world we live in.
Yes, I feel like the world we live in is either, full of people that are extremely subjective or extremely objective.
Yes.
Hence why the difference in faith and people who do not have faith in the modern world and believe science is the only way forward and all of that. But another very interesting thing that I think about is when you talk about subjective and objective and this whole examined life. Is the human examination subjective, or is it purely objective? Because it has to be tangible, it has to be very real and existing. There is a clear lack of subjectivity in the way modern life is pursued or created, because you don't actually make a conscientious effort to understand your circumstances. It's very much about not being conditioned to your circumstances, but they also believe, at least people who think they're conditioned would think they're conditioned by that because, that's the way forward. And how do we do that? Are we conditioned? Is being conditioned wrong is another question. I mean, we can be subjective and objective about that. That's something I would like to talk about lastly.
Excellent. A few things. First, there is a question here of how to organize knowledge that should be taught in schools, knowledge that should be politically voted on and consider. So there's an entire other question lurking here of the socioeconomic way to go about navigating this tension between the objective and the subjective. The best book on this that I really like is called Kindly Inquisitors by Jonathan Rauch. That is a masterpiece that is discussing the tensions between the navigations of what he calls belief and knowledge. And indeed, it is very important to note that there is something special about the scientific method, that as an epistemological method is almost like a skeleton key that unlocks the ability to kind of agree on there is a higher probability that this is true, even if we technically can't know it's true, than not, therefore to organize society around it and to teach it as knowledge, even if it might actually be false. Because the scientific method can't give you verification. only falsification following Karl Popper, but that makes room for a distinction between belief and knowledge becomes a higher probability of being actual around which belief can orbit. So now you can have an open but not entirely opened sociological structure. Okay, now a lot more has to be said on that, but the book Kindly Inquisitors is insanely good. I highly suggest it because it's dealing with the nitty-gritty of this problem. That actually, he wrote this in the early 90s, and he was like, hey, I think it was 94 maybe. He's like, hey, if we don't figure this out, we're in huge trouble. And yeah,
it was before I was even born.
I know, right? That's why nobody read it, because it couldn't have mattered if you weren't in the world yet. So absolutely. But that book's really good on this problem. The second thing on the question of is it good to be conditioned or not, it's inevitable to be conditioned in the same way that it's inevitable to be philosophical, to think, to be a political unit. You are, by definition, engaged in political participation unless you're an isolationist, like a true isolationist, which like nobody is, unless you're like alone in the Amazon or something, right? So it's kind of like asking, is politics good or is politics bad? It's inevitable. Is philosophy good or is philosophy bad? It's inevitable. Here's the thing. Actually, denying the inevitability of it increases the probability that you do it poorly. See, that's what's happened. Like we're talking about all this bad examination. Yeah. That is greatly a result of people thinking they don't need to examine, ironically. By not owning the fact that they need to examine, they still examine, they just do it badly. And so likewise with politics, it's actually quite dangerous where we have all these people saying, I don't do politics, I hate politics. I get it. But here's the problem. You're still going to do politics. You're still going to be part of politics. And if you don't think about it and be engaged in it, there's still going to be a political structure. And it's probably going to suck because the majority of people hate politics who are in it. And when a lot of people are part of something who hate the thing that they're part of, it tends to become pathological and it tends to become very, very bad. So the question is, how do we condition ourselves in a manner that creates a positive feedback loop between us and the situation and other people so that everyone benefits? That question that you just asked basically is why you end up having, at that point, though, it becomes situational. Like every situation, the exact practicality of what that looks like depends on what you're talking about, what you're dealing with, and what you're thinking about. Ergo, you end up with 100 pieces in friggin' thoughts because you have to go through every situation. But that, again, the very fact that it is situational is another reason to think that good philosophy, good examination is probably inevitable, that you're probably going to not be making a good bet to avoid philosophy, even if technically you might be able to have a fine life without it. The probability, especially as the world increasingly complexifies, becomes less and less because there are so many situations you have to go through. The probability of you guessing right every single time without examination, given that the differences are so nuanced and unclear and not self-evident, like the difference between worry and like care, like we were saying earlier, empathy and sympathy, it is the likelihood of you guessing right in all of those unique situations that are going to multiply due to the complexity of the modern world is low. And so it probably is not a good bet to avoid the examined life. But then, of course, it's important to realize what one means by examination. And that's where going back to Socrates and maybe paying attention to what he said could be of use to us.
All right, Daniel, that was all wonderful. Thank
you. You're wonderful. Thank you, Sandy.
Thank you for entertaining my questions and my interrogation about thoughts. Everyone should go grab it. It's great. It's very smooth. It's very short. It's 100 different reflections, but it's very easy to read. And I think if you need something to think about at night, Thoughts is your book.
You are very kind.
Now, tell us when part 2 is coming out.
Funny enough, I actually do have 100 more pieces put together in Second Thoughts, but I'm going to put that after Belonging Again, Absolute Choice, different things like that. So we'll see, maybe a year or two. I've got a few lined up, so we'll see.
That's great. Keep them coming, Daniel. They're all wonderful. And we're so happy, that you share all your work with us. We really are. I say we, I speak on behalf of the entire philosophy community online. I'm sure they'll all agree. Thank you for being in conversation with me, Daniel. I hope you have a wonderful day.
You do the same, Sandy. I enjoyed it immensely.